we don't want to cut you short at any time. So I'm so happy for us to have Professor Jesse Rainbow from the Department of Religion at the University of Houston, and who has been visited our class before. I think maybe that Ted and Sybil Estes, who were with the Honors College and were at Covenant several years ago, told us you really need to have Jesse Rainbow come, and we did, and it's always been just excellent and well regarded. And I told you, Jesse, but we sent a survey to our members to see what kind of classes they wanted, and one of the things that came up was let's have Jesse Rainbow come back. you were a named suspect, so appreciate you. So rather than tell you, I'll just let you take over and tell us about what you're going to talk about both this week and next week.
Yeah. Well, good morning and thank you. And it's good to be with you after many months. I know that in the time since I was last with your class that you've lost a number of members of the congregation, and including some faces that were regular in the class and that I will miss today and the next time that I'm with you. I looked at your in memoriam page on your website, and I had seen Sidney Burris's obituary and in the paper and mourned his loss. He was always so kind to me when I visited, and I saw several other people I recognized on your website. So anyway, I wanted to just begin by offering my condolences to the church and to acknowledge the absence of those people this morning. My topic this morning is going to be one of the most polarizing figures in the Bible, Judah's king Manasseh, who reigned from 698 BC to 644 BC. Now, I say that he was polarizing, but in the Bible, he's not really polarizing. He's polarized. We have to use the passive participle, by which I mean that rather than the Bible presenting him as somebody who engendered a radical division of opinion among his contemporaries, the Bible portrays him as someone who is entirely on one side of a moral spectrum. So the Bible isn't claiming that he was polarizing. The Bible is claiming that Manasseh was a pole, that he was a pole around, in fact, around which the rest of the Israelite history turned in some important ways. He was bad. No ifs, ands, or buts. No evidence to the contrary offered. So Manasseh's reign is comparatively briefly narrated in 2 Kings chapter 21. And I want to show you today that he casts a shadow in the Bible's history, both forwards and backwards. His reign was of 55 years was a moment in terms of which both earlier and later events came to be understood, and it's presented that way in the Bible. But this polar view of Manasseh is a function of the biblical history. For people who lived at the time of Manasseh, he was not polar, but polarizing. He was not a figure who represented a moral extreme, but a figure who represented division. And if you had lived at the time, maybe you would have known someone, your neighbor or another member of your family, who had the exact opposite view of Manasseh as you did. If you thought Manasseh was the greatest king that Israel ever had, your neighbor thought that he was the worst king that Israel or Judah ever had, and vice versa. So the presentation of the Bible, and I'm not, my purpose here is not to arouse suspicion of the Bible, but rather criticism, rather an understanding of how the Bible is saying what it's saying, rather than a questioning of whether the Bible's position is correct or not. So this view that we have of Manasseh is a point of view, like all historians offer. It's an interpretation of the past, not a videotape of the past. It's an expression of the ideology and the theology of the biblical historian, an ideology and a theology that we may well want to embrace as Christians, as readers of the Bible. But it's a point of view nonetheless. So I'm going to open my Bible here to 2 Kings chapter 21 and give you just a moment to do the same, if you like. And I'm going to also turn my phone off. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to read the story here. It's not super long, but it would be worth doing here. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practices of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal, made a sacred pole as King Ahab of Israel had done, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury, and dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. The carved image of Asherah that he made, he set in the house of the Lord, the house of which the Lord said to David and his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them." But they did not listen. Manasseh misled them to do more evil than the nations had done that the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. The Lord said by his servants the prophets, "Because King Manasseh of Judah has committed these abominations, has done things more wicked than all that the Amorites did who were before him, and has caused Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore, says the Lord, the God of Israel, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such evil that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line for Samaria and the plummet for the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger, since the day their ancestors came out of Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, because the sin that he caused Judah to sin, so that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, all that he did, and the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Manasseh slept with his ancestors and was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of Uzzah. His son Ammon succeeded him. Wow, I can tell that it's been 500 days since I've spoken in public. I need to learn how to read again without stuttering. Okay. Now, that's a pretty clear view that 2 Kings chapter 21 offers. Recently, I was reading another book of ancient history, a book written by the Roman historian Tacitus. Specifically, the part of it that I was reading was his account of the succession of the Emperor Tiberius to the throne of Augustus, which happened in 14 AD. Like the biblical historian here, Tacitus has a particular view of Augustus. And in this case, there's no doubt that much in the same way that the biblical historian is critical of Manasseh, Tacitus is critical of Augustus and of Tiberius. Just as the Bible compares Manasseh negatively to the law of Moses and to the deeds of his father Hezekiah, Tacitus judges Augustus and Tiberius negatively in comparison, not with the law of Moses, but with the ideals of the Roman Republic that came before them. And I would add, much as the biblical history is concerned to give a grand overarching narrative of the Israelite and the Judean history, and to give grand causal explanations of why things happened the way they happened and who was to blame. So also Tacitus's analysis of the first century of the early emperors, beginning with Tiberius, is a grand history and one that traces a history of decline when measured against a ancient historical standard. Tacitus is telling a big story, just like the Bible is. Now, both of these historians, I'll get to why I'm talking about Tacitus in a minute here. Both of these historians are critical. They're critical historians in the sense that they have a point. They have something to say about the past, and they're not merely archivists or chroniclers who are telling you a list of events of the past. Both the Bible and someone like Tacitus are giving an interpretation of the meaning of history. They're making claims about what the past meant and why things happened. The thing that struck me about Tacitus's account of really the death of Augustus is that while he clearly takes a side to the detriment of Augustus, as he's doing so, he tells his reader what both sides of the story were at the time. I'll just read you a short passage here. There was much discussion, this is at the time of Augustus's death, there was much discussion of Augustus himself. Most people were struck by meaningless points such as the coincidence between the dates of his first public office and of his death, the fact that he died in the same house as his father, etc. Hold on. One opinion was as follows of Augustus: filial duty in a national emergency in which there was no place for law-abiding conduct had driven him to civil war. He made many concessions to Antony and Lepidus for the sake of vengeance on his father's murderers, etc., etc. Augustus had put the state in order, not by making himself king or dictator, but by creating the Principate. This is the pro-Augustus side. Augustus had reasons for doing what he did. Sure, he eroded Republican ideals, but he had reasons. After all, a son should be able to avenge the death of his father. There were these sort of portentous coincidences about his reign. And, you know, nobody's perfect, but Augustus did things for the right reasons. Tacitus goes on. The opposite view went like this: filial duty and national crisis had been merely pretexts. In fact, the motive of Octavian, the future Augustus, was lust for power. Inspired by that, he had mobilized the army, etc., etc. Okay, so Tacitus he has a point of view, and he takes little pot shots at the positive point of view along the way. And he offers the negative point of view second in his story, so that it's like the last word on Augustus is the negative view of him, that he was really lusting for power, and all these excuses for him, they were just pretexts. But nevertheless, he tells you what both sides of the story were. He presents, in other words, he presents Augustus as a polarizing figure, the very thing that the Bible doesn't do. He presents him as someone who had both detractors and supporters. Now, he was bad, ultimately, from Tacitus's point of view, but Tacitus acknowledges that opinions differed, and that his historical judgment is an argument based on evidence rather than a self-evident fact that everybody could have seen plain as day at the time. The biblical historian does not do this in the case of Manasseh, in the passage that I read to you, nor in many other cases in the book of Kings. When it comes to the kings of Israel and Judah, the Bible offers explicit, binary, black and white evaluations of people. And then it presents the evidence on its side. But it doesn't complicate these judgments with mitigating evidence or with contrary arguments. In 2 Kings 21, we can go back and look at the beginning of what I read. With the historian's judgment is already there in verse 2. Manasseh did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And this little passage is following a pattern that's obtains for all of the kings of Judah and Israel in this history. And so let's take a look at the parts of it. And I should have brought a glass of water in here. So in verse 1, the historian reports the basic biographical and chronological facts. How old Manasseh was when he came to the throne, how long he ended up reigning, who his mother was. And this is the pattern throughout the book. Basic facts, including a black and white judgment of the person, although sometimes in a few cases there's a mixed evaluation. And then an account of the deeds of that king that backs up and vindicates the overall moral evaluation that was offered at the beginning of the story. So if we turn back to chapter 18, for instance, a couple pages back, let's look at his father, Hezekiah. Chapter 18, verse 1, we see the same pattern. It begins with, I'm sorry, there's something here that isn't in the case of Manasseh. Let me explain why that is. The account of Hezekiah begins with a synchronism to the series of kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you were to keep reading back before 2 Kings 18, you'd see that this is actually the normal pattern. You begin by saying who was king in the other city, whether it's Jerusalem or Samaria, at the time the king took the throne. Now, the reason we don't have that for Manasseh is that it was during the reign of Hezekiah that the northern kingdom was destroyed, and its last king, Hoshea, who's named in 2 Kings 18:1, he was deposed, and there were no more kings in Samaria. And so Manasseh is the first king of Judah in the series whose account doesn't begin with a synchronism. But then we get into the pattern, which is the age of the king when he took the throne, the length of his reign, the name of his mother. In the case of Hezekiah, we also have the name of the king's maternal grandfather. And then a statement, an overall statement about whether he was good or bad. That's in 2 Kings 18:3. And then following that summary judgment, a list of the evidence that supports the judgment. And nowhere in there do we have, at least in these two kings so far, nowhere in there do we have, some people said that Hezekiah was good, other people said that Hezekiah was bad. And here's what I, the historian, say, right? So This is a fundamental difference between the Roman historian Tacitus and the Bible. I'll say something about the names of the mothers and the names of the fathers. Presumably, the kings of Israel and Judah took their wives from among aristocratic families. And so these names would have meant something to someone who knew who they were. Now, unfortunately, for readers of the Bible today, most of the mothers and grandfathers of the kings are completely obscure, and this is all that we know about them. So that's what I have to say about that. It's an interesting little piece of data, but not one that we can do much with. Sometimes it tells you what city they're from, and then from this we can kind of maybe extrapolate a picture of like the sphere of influence of the king in Jerusalem over some village 30 miles away, but it's mostly obscure. Okay, so yeah, in verse 3 of chapter 18, in verse 3 we have the regnal evaluation of Hezekiah, and it's the opposite of Manasseh. Hezekiah was good, Manasseh was bad in the eyes of the Bible. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know this or come to such a simple judgment if you read the stories about Hezekiah. You know, Hezekiah had some ups and downs, to be honest, including in his relationship with God. Like, it wasn't all a rose garden. He had crises, and he even did the thing that probably Manasseh did, that Manasseh is blamed for, which is that he submitted to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But all of that comes out in the wash when it comes to giving an overall evaluation. Hezekiah is good, Manasseh is bad. Even though his story is a complex story, it all just gets boiled down to a one-dimensional evaluation, that he was a good guy. Similarly, for Manasseh's grandson, Josiah, and we can flip ahead to chapter 22. So this is at the very beginning of chapter 22. We get Josiah's age, no synchronism, there's no more kings in Israel still. We get his age, we get the length of his reign, we get his mother's name and his maternal grandfather's name. And this is one of those places where we get the hometown of the mother, or the hometown of the grandfather, at least. And then we get, yeah.
If you need to get water, feel free to go get some. We won't leave you.
All right, can I do that?
Sure, of course.
Yes, go get some.
I'm out of practice from the summer here. All right, I'll be right back.
Sure.
Laura, the message you put in chat said I had it wrong. The Bible says you have to wear a mask.
And physically distance. It's
Oh my
right there in the
gosh.
Bible.
And I have to have my hair unkempt.
Not a hard thing to do if you're ill.
So thank you for correcting me. And you're sure there's no other passage that says that nobody has a right to tell you not to wear a mask?
I didn't say that, but I don't think there is.
Well, thank you for that research.
You're welcome.
Okay, let me pick back up here. In between Josiah and Manasseh, I'll point this out. The father of Josiah, there is a very short little paragraph on him. He's an interesting guy. He seems to have been named after the Egyptian god Amun, which is something I might talk about next week when I get to that, but so I mention it now. He had a brief 2-year reign and he gets a short little paragraph. So we're back to Josiah here. Yes, we get a very cut and dry moral evaluation that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. He walked in the ways of his father David, and he didn't turn to the right or the left. So Manasseh's long reign of 55 years and his unambiguously negative evaluation is sandwiched between two good kings. In fact, two of the best kings, according to the Hebrew Bible. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 5, Hezekiah is said to have been unlike anyone who came before him or after him. Interestingly, he's also the only king in the book of Kings of whom it is said that the Lord was with him in 2 Kings 18:7, from which some scholars have deduced that Hezekiah was none other than Emmanuel, God with us. It's not an exact match, but it's an unusual phrase in the story of Hezekiah that God was with him. And then in the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, you get this prophecy to Hezekiah's father around the time of Hezekiah's birth that he would have a son, the king would have a son, and possibly the king would have a son, and his name would be God with us. So that's an interesting little distinction that Hezekiah enjoys in the Bible. And then in 2 Kings 23:25, speaking about at the end of Josiah's life, we're told that Josiah too was unique and that there was no king like him before him or after him. Now you may be wondering how there can be two kings that were each the most special king ever. I had a grandmother who used to tell us grandchildren that we were all the most special grandchild. She was unwilling to rank us, even when we pressed her for a logical explanation of how anyone could be special if we were all special. Although I've always suspected that one of my cousins was just a little bit more special than us because he got away with things that none of the rest of us did. So some biblical scholars, based on this apparent self-contradiction or redundancy in the Bible's claims about who was the most special king ever, some scholars, including Bill's teacher in graduate school, have speculated that perhaps this book originally ended with the statement about Hezekiah, that the book ended on a high note. The most recent king is the most special king ever. But then someone later came along and revised it and added a few more kings, and that there was a version that ended with Josiah, who became the most special king ever. So that what we have in the Bible here is not an indecisive grandmother, but the opinions of two different people, each of whom had a favorite king in the story. So what was so special about Hezekiah? Other than that he might have been the most recent king to the person who wrote about him. Well, Hezekiah was the king when Jerusalem was delivered from the Neo-Assyrians. This is a remarkable event that I know that I've talked about at your church before. It's the subject of Byron's poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib. And what was so special about Josiah? Again, other than that he might have been the most recent king or the favorite of the author who wrote this about him. Well, Josiah was the king who rediscovered the law of Moses, reinstituted the Passover for the first time since Joshua, according to the Bible. And he's the first king who actually lived up to the standard against which kings like Manasseh were judged, namely fidelity to the law of Moses. Now, footnote on this idea of a sort of recency bias in the Bible, the idea that the biblical authors favor the king whose reign they lived in and are writing about. This recency bias is a sort of tendency to see the events of one's own lifetime as unique in history. So I pointed out these two examples in the Bible, and the assumption that people behave like this is one of the premises of this idea of a multi-stage history. I've recently heard people saying, and maybe you have too, that America has never been more divided. A statement that I'm sure is plausible to many of us who are living through recent events. Unless you happen to be a historian of, let's say, the 1850s and 1860s, then the statement that America has never been more divided sounds a little bit myopic, doesn't it? And in fact, while there have been some moments in our history of perceived national unity, like I think of after 9/11, many generations of Americans, I think, have regarded the political divisions of their own time as unique in history. And indeed, future generations of Americans may view the year 2021 as not having been particularly divided. Can you imagine that? Future generations looking back on us and thinking it wasn't really as bad as they thought it was compared to our own period. They may well come to regard us as a generation that thought it was divided, but they may measure our divisions in light of some fundamental unity that emerges from all of this and has yet to manifest itself to us. You know, perhaps someday in the near future, we're all going to draw together and overcome some great crisis together. And if that happens, then history will regard us as a generation that had more unity than it thought it did. Or, I'm being very positive there. Let me be negative. Or what may happen is that a clear winner may emerge from our divisions. And that winner, as all winners do, will get to write the history. And the history will regard the losing side of our current divisions as historically anomalous. Perhaps a division that seems intractable to us living through it will prove to have been tractable. Someone who we think of as a contender may end up proving to have been a historical loser. And it will seem to future generations that one of the sides or the other never had a chance to begin with. Now, I'm not making predictions here. I mean, I guess that could be good news or bad news, depending on how you understand what I just said. But I'm not making predictions. I'm trying to offer a historian's view of, through the long lens of history, and imagining that, as it always has before, that the future will offer some kind of 20/20 hindsight that makes the present perception of clarity that we enjoy seem to be rather muddled. And that, I think, is the fate of Manasseh in the biblical history. The Bible judges him clearly as Judah's uniquely bad king, sandwiched between two of Judah's uniquely good kings. But what if, and this is where I'm getting today, what if the biblical historian had been more like the Roman historian Tacitus? What if the biblical historian had written not only the case against Manasseh, which we'll look at in a minute, his own point of view, but what if he had also given us even without necessarily endorsing it, the case for Manasseh, the alternative point of view. Are we to imagine that Manasseh reigned for 55 years and didn't have any friends? I mean, you can see what happened to his son. His son reigned for 2 years and was assassinated. And no one did that to Manasseh for 55 years. Are we to suppose that Manasseh reigned for 55 years and never did anything right? I don't know, what's the saying about a broken clock? You know, a broken clock is right twice a day. How many times is a bad king right in 55 years? Well, we don't hear about any in the Bible. Or even if he was wrong all the time, even if he was a terrible person, which may well be the case to the extent that anybody can be boiled down to a sentence, are we to suppose that there were not other terrible people in Judah who liked him? And what did they have to say? That seems to be what Tacitus is doing, right? I mean, Tacitus doesn't agree with the defenders of Augustus, but he'll tell you what they said, if for no other reason that he can poke holes in it. So in short, what I'm working up to here is, what is the case for Manasseh? And I think I'm going to get to that next week. I'm planning to get to that next week and talk a little bit more about that. But I want to end today by talking more about the case against Manasseh, because there's more to say about that, and it's rather interesting, more than what I've read. I've read you the part of the book of Kings in chapter 21 that belongs to Manasseh. But as I told you when I began, this long reign that's boiled down to a short account, it casts a shadow forwards and backwards. His account, by the way, you should notice, is much shorter than the accounts of Hezekiah and Josiah that surround it, even though they reigned for about 20 years shorter than he did. They get much more press in the Bible because they're good. So Manasseh's long reign may in fact have been something of an embarrassment for the writer of the Bible. Someone who believed that God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. How can a God who punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous allow the worst king ever to get reelected for 55 years? Well, he wasn't reelected. The present is bleeding into the past. I'm sorry. How could God allow him to reign for 55 years? My republicanism, my Roman republicanism is seeping into the Israelite monarchism there. There's a similar problem, by the way, with Josiah. Josiah, who's one of the best kings ever. Well, he has a decently long reign of 31 years, but he dies in an ignominious way. He's killed in battle by a foreign king. And so you might also ask, how could a God who rewards the righteous allow the most righteous king to be cut down in his prime in a kind of random way by a foreign king? So I mentioned earlier that Manasseh's reign casts a shadow backwards and forwards. And so I want to talk about that idea. I said at the very beginning that Manasseh is a pole around which the Israelite history rotates. We see this idea already within chapter 21. There's some comparisons that are made in chapter 21 that are important to the historian. So for instance, I'm on the wrong page. For instance, he's compared to his father Hezekiah in verse 3, right? Manasseh undid the good that Hezekiah did. So there's an implicit comparison, an implicit contrast between the Father and the Son there. He's also compared, and this is a comparison rather than a contrast. He's compared to King Ahab, the northern king, who is, well, there's a reason that Herman Melville named Captain Ahab after him. He's an unambiguously bad king of the northern kingdom that was in Samaria. Moreover, in the chapter 21, starting in verse 10, the historian puts these words on the lips of the prophets that because of King Manasseh, Jerusalem is eventually going to get to be destroyed. So Manasseh ends up being, the Judean history has ups and downs. It has good and bad kings, but one of them is blamed for the disaster with which the kingdom ended. And that's Manasseh. He bears on his shoulders the responsibility for the burning of Jerusalem in 587. And in fact, in chapter 24, verse 3, when that actually happens, when King Nebuchadnezzar actually comes to destroy the city, the historian reminds us and says, "Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh." For the sins of Manasseh. So Manasseh in the book of Kings is not only the worst king ever, he's a programmatic character. He plays a programmatic role. He provides the explanation for why the thing ended the way it did. That's the shadow that he casts forward into history. What about the shadow that he casts backward into history? Well, I want to take us back to the 18th chapter of Deuteronomy. So I'll give you a little bit more of a moment to flip back there because it's a lot of pages. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. This is, I won't read this whole thing. When you come in, this is on the lips of Moses, as Moses is standing just on the other side of the Jordan River before the Israelites cross over. Of course, Moses would not go with them, but he gives this long sermon in Deuteronomy as his kind of final statement. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. And then there's a long list of different names for witchcraft and sorcery and augury and divination, and one that's especially worth noting, no one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire. Now, if we go back to what I read from 2 Kings 21, Deuteronomy 18 is remarkably on the nose as a description of Manasseh's sins. So from the biblical point of view, Moses said this back in the late Bronze Age, and then for whatever reason, Manasseh just happened to do all of the things that Moses said not to do all those years before. The biblical critical scholars date the Deuteronomy to the reign of Josiah, and since around the year 1800 have assumed that the book of the law that Josiah found in the temple is nothing other than an early version of Deuteronomy. So from that point of view, whoever wrote the book of Deuteronomy put on the lips of Moses a commandment not to be like Manasseh. So that's the shadow that Manasseh casts into the past, right? There's one more little, and I have 2 minutes left. There's one more little place that Manasseh shows up that's kind of interesting. And this is in the book of Judges, chapter 18. And you're not going to see it in your English Bible, but I'm going to tell you about it. So Judges chapter 18, and I'm in verse 30. Judges 18 is this, how do I characterize this briefly? It's a story of Micah, who, sets up an idol, and he's kind of this bad priest, let's say. Let's just summarize it that way. The story of a kind of lousy priest. In chapter 18, verse 30, the Danites set up idols, which is related to something that Jeroboam did when he set up an idol in the city of Dan. This is now telling the story, an origin story with the ancestors named Dan. The Danites set up an idol for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the land went into captivity. So here we have a descendant of Moses through his son Gershom becoming an idolater. Now this is, there's a lot of politics involved here, biblical politics involved here in terms of the different orders of priests. There's a priest that were in Shiloh and descended from Moses, but then you have the priests in Jerusalem, and they didn't always get along. And so here we have, one of the Mushite priests, one of the sons of descendants of Moses, turning away from the law of Moses. Well, later on, when the law of Moses becomes the Bible, becomes the scripture, this is extremely embarrassing verse, because it casts some aspersion on Moses, or at least it associates Moses with something that is embarrassing and evil. And so at some point, the Hebrew scribes fixed the problem by inserting a single letter into the middle of the name of Moses, the letter N, or the Hebrew letter Nun. And they you can put a nun in the middle of the word Moses, and it turns it into Manasseh. They're exactly the same in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, it's Moshe and then Manasseh. So a scribe fixed this embarrassing verse related to Moses by implicating the name of Manasseh in a negative way. And they knew that they were kind of fudging the record. And so they wrote the N just above the line. And so when you're reading this in Hebrew, the letters go like this, and then they go up, and then they go back down. And it's called the suspended nun. It's unique in the Bible, in a Hebrew Bible. And you can see your footnote, tells you then, if you're in the NRSV like I am, that it's either Moses or Manasseh. But I'll end with that little, because of the negative view of Manasseh in the Bible, he was fair game for this sort of thing, at least in the mind of one scribe. And they created a kind of interesting little textual artifact. All right, let me get to, okay. So as I suggested, we can imagine that there's another side to this story. If the Bible were Tacitus, we would have heard it, but we don't. We can imagine that the moral clarity that the Bible offers us on this figure is a function of hindsight, and that people living at the time who did not know that their lives were going to fit into some grand history someday, they might have had conflicting views about Manasseh. And if no one else did, at least Manasseh thought he was okay. And that's what I want to return to next week. And I'll call it the case for Manasseh. We're going to imagine what the other side of the story was. And I'm going to try to offer some meta level reflections on what the value of telling that other side of the story is, even if we don't accept that other side of the story. What the value of that might be, especially for people like us who are themselves living in a polarized and divided age, or so we think. Okay, I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jesse. As always, you make us think about things. I never thought about that. I didn't know that. I'm thinking here, well, should I keep watching MSNBC or switch over to Fox or just stick with PBS? That's where I'm going to get Tacitus.
I think you should just do what I do and read Tacitus instead of watching the news.
That's, oh, that's it. Anybody else have, in the little time we've got left here, have questions? Let me put it on.
I haven't been paying attention to the chat here. Oh,
Bill,
it's telling me to come
Klein?
on.
Yeah. Again, thank you for that. Two observations. One, it sounds like the criterion for judging any of these kings is fidelity to the law of Moses. And it reminds me of our contemporary figures, especially political, and maybe judge their fidelity to progressive principles or conservative principles, as opposed to a more objective measure, did society function, their leadership, et cetera. And secondly, the anecdotes about Manasseh, or the evidence that Manasseh was a bad king, kind of sounds more like a Bob Woodward book. All these anecdotes of killed this person or cheated this person, than an objective recitation of how did the nation fare under Manasseh's leadership, which was 55 years. So I guess if I had a question, and I don't know if this is a question, are those that have, as the Bible professes a judgment of Manasseh, is it taking into account the big sweep of things, of history, or is it pretty much a contemporary account of how people are reacting to Manasseh at the time?
Yeah, well, I'm going to try to imagine how people who lived in the time of Manasseh would have viewed him, but the Bible doesn't give us that in the way that Tacitus does. Now, it may well be that in God's wisdom, it's better for our Bible to have, a clear judgment than a multifaceted historical record. So, I don't want to suggest that the Bible's view of this is inadequate for faith and life, let's say.
Sure.
But as a historian, I think we can use our imagination. Now, you also mentioned this idea of judging the past by the present. I think we have an awful lot of that today in our society. Going back and looking at something that someone said many years ago by today's standards, that's just it would be too polarizing for me to give examples of this, but I feel like I've seen this quite a bit in the news of, now I also have to admit that I like it when certain statues get taken down, and I have a mixed, I'm not taking a strong side on this, but so I think we have the right and a responsibility to manage and interpret the past. But the past cannot have tyranny over us in that way. But we also have this other tendency in our society, which is to not be interested in the historical context of certain things. I don't know. It's you let the listener understand. It's a complicated and nuanced issue today, and we probably err on both sides of it as a society. So yeah, that's thank you for that comment.
And thank you.
Billy Graham, one of his sermons he always preached in his crusades was Manasseh, the wickedest man in the Bible, or maybe the wickedest man in history. And son Franklin, when he was starts preaching, he picked that sermon up for himself as well. Maybe I'll ask Franklin to turn in next week and see whether Manasseh should be seen as that measured wickedness. Thanks again, Jesse. We really look forward to hear you next week.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.